aware of yesterday. Bill Sotheby is not doing well. He's struggling with health issues. He's got some viral infections going on, and so if you could remember him in your prayers, I'm sure and certain that you would appreciate a phone call or a text just to let him know that you're thinking of him as well. Benny Mosley is continuing to do well, from what I hear, and so he's moving in the right direction, and we're so thankful for answered prayers in that regard. So again, reaching out to him, he has also coveted your prayers and your phone calls and texts. So before we get started this morning, let's go ahead and go to our Father in a word of prayer. Almighty God and gracious Heavenly Father, we approach your throne thanking you for all the blessings of this life. Father, we're so thankful for this opportunity that we have to come together this morning as your body and to study another portion of your word so that we can grow thereby. Father, we're mindful of the many that are struggling with health issues, and we ask that you be with them and help them to recover their much needed health. Father, we're mindful of those who have recovered their health, and we're so thankful for answered prayers on their behalf. Father, we're grateful that we serve you, and we're so thankful for all that you do for us in this life. So picking up this morning in Romans chapter 2, we really kind of left off in verses, we'll reprise 8 through 13. Am I not on? Is that better? You're welcome. Hey, all right, I don't have to yell. That's great. I thought it sounded a little quiet, but I was like, well, maybe it's just the adjustments. So 8 through 13, Paul is dealing with, in chapter 2, Paul moves into the idea of those that are hypocritical in their practice or exercise of law. So in verse 8, he says, unto them that are contentious and do not obey the truth. And key part about this, as we move through the rest of the text, is going to be dealing with obedience. That is, fidelity to the law that has been entrusted to those individuals at that time. Are all men amenable to God? Yes, they are. And in every dispensation and time period, God has demanded mankind or humanity adhere to a moral law. And so now what we're looking at is Paul talking about the fact that man cannot perfectly adhere to that moral law, and so finds himself under condemnation. All right? It doesn't matter if it was the law of Moses or if it was the natural law as revealed to the Gentiles and God, that moral compass or that sense of moral oughtness in individuals. There was a violation of that law regardless of what dispensation one was under or which law one adhered to. But again, he says, do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness, indignation and wrath, tribulation and anguish. Upon who? What does he say here? Everyone. So is anyone left out of this discussion? What's that? It is all-inclusive. You fit into one of two categories. That is obedient, faithful, disobedient, unfaithful. There's no in-between. Nobody can be Switzerland, all right? That's not an option. He says, every man that doeth evil, the Jew first, and also of the Gentile. Again, so no one's left out. But glory and honor and peace to every man that works good, to the Jew first, and also to the Gentile. For there's no respect of persons with God. God's judgment and the law... Well, I don't know why that's in there. That is not part of the text. For as many have sinned without law shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. For not the hearers of the law are just before God, but the doers of the law shall be justified. So when we look at this text, who is going to be justified here? What's that? The ones that do the law. Does this sound like another place in the New Testament that we read about? Where's that? It does sound familiar, doesn't it? What about the book of James? Okay. Whoso looketh into the perfect law of liberty and continueth therein, he being not a what? Forgetful hearer, but a doer of the word, this man is blessed in his deed. Again, so... can we be saved without works? Are we saved by works? No, okay? The two have to come together. They work together. Faith without works, James tells us, is dead being alone. Paul makes it abundantly clear that works are an element of faithfulness to God. So anyone who would argue that a Christian can be a Christian without actually living the Christian life has left the reservation when it comes to what Christianity is and teaches. Okay, and Paul will get into that in detail in just a moment. Now, we kind of began to get into this discussion, verses 14 through 16. He says, when the Gentiles which have not, by the way, that shouldn't say the law, because that might confuse us when it comes to the rendering there. But it should probably read, which have not law. Okay? Do by nature the things contained in the law. That would be the law of Moses. Okay? Having not the law are a law unto themselves, which show the work of the law written in their hearts, their conscience also bearing witness, and their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. What is he saying here? Very simple, straightforward text, right? It's a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, by the way. Okay.
She having access to God. She's living in a city that's not God. She's got an occupation that's terrible, yet she did the right thing at the right time. Grace.
Interesting thought. So Joash brings up Rahab back in Joshua when the children of Israel go in and take Jericho, and Rahab actually accommodates the children of Israel, God's people, and therefore she's granted a place. Yes, her works superseded in that regard some of the other things that she had done, and so there was a sense of oughtness in that way.
I meant more as like she didn't have access to God.
Yeah,
she didn't know what the right thing was, but she understood that probably should help these guys out. Like her heart was in the right place. That's more of what I was talking about. Not
okay.
necessarily that she got access or her works did anything, but that she changed her perspective or at least did something, because she's in a bad place herself. She's not the greatest. She doesn't have a good job. She's a prostitute. So she's got a different outlook on life. And so when she's presented with something that's different, she's like, all right, you guys are outliers. You guys are outliers too. I'll give you guys refuge. She's doing the same thing that Jesus wanted us to do again, which is take care of her brothers. So she saw somebody in need, gave them to eat. That's more of what
Okay, so Joash mentions the idea that Rahab saw the need of the Canaanites there and accommodated that need in that respect, even though she did not have the divine revelation of the law of Moses that the children of Israel had. All right. Any other thoughts about this text? So how many are Jews in here? Do we have any Jews in here? No. Okay. So where are we in this discussion? Outside of Christianity, where would we fall? Gentiles, yeah. One of us are Gentiles. We're Gentile Christians, right? But if we did not have Christianity, per the biblical text and the way it divides everything, we would be considered Gentiles. So what is he talking about here? What is going on? Is this text giving anybody difficulty?
Let your conscience be your guide.
Jiminy Cricket, right? By the way, you know why he was called Jiminy Cricket, JC? It was actually a play on words there to be Jesus Christ, the initials, to guide Pinocchio in that way. But we could go into all that kind of lore later. But you look at this idea of letting your conscience be your guide. Is your conscience an appropriate guide for all things that are right and good? Why not? I see Debbie saying no. Selfishness? Okay, so a conscience enforces what in someone's life? A conscience enforces the rightness or the wrongness of an action, okay? And so what a conscience does for us is it tells us that we violated our convictions, doesn't it? Is a conscience a great thing to hear? Yes, while you hear it, okay? But maybe if we're in the act of doing something that we want to do, we don't want to hear that. And so we have this discussion, by the way, in more than just Romans in the New Testament about the conscience, okay? The conscience can be deadened through continual sin. And so an individual ceases to hear the voice of the conscience anymore. Why is the conscience important here when Paul is discussing condemnation of all those that are under sin? Again, we got to step back and look at big picture. Gentiles don't have the law of Moses, so are they without any law? Huh? No. What law do they have? Secular law? Okay, there is a secular law in the sense that there is a code of conduct that's been instituted by societies that determine to live together. There you go. The moral law that is inherently understood that these things are right or wrong. Did God ever tell Cain, don't murder, don't kill folk? Not that we see, right? So why was he condemned? Why was he cursed for killing Abel? Because it was wrong. Because, yeah, it seems to be one of those non sequitur, right? You don't have to say these things. It naturally follows that it's wrong to murder. What else is it wrong to do? Steal. Interesting. Wrong to steal. Okay, so murder is stealing one's life. Stealing is covetousness of someone else's things. Commit adultery, stealing somebody else's spouse. All of these things are wrong, sinful.
I could be wrong about this, but when you mention Cain and Abel, Cain is deceptive about what he had done. And, he doesn't come right out and say, I killed my brother. He says, my brother's killed. So that deception implies an understanding of that what he did was not a good thing. And certainly, if the Bible, if during biblical times, or even before that, in ancient times, if there wasn't a moral law, there would be total anarchy, but we don't have that story. So at some point, a teaching of moral law had come through society.
Yeah, or there is, as we see in Romans, an inherent sense of moral oughtness in humanity. Yes, we need to be convicted. The conscience can be instructed, but that conscience only tells us what things we're convicted of ourselves, right? So Paul had a clean conscience by hauling people off to prison and killing them. How, if that's wrong? Well, because his understanding was such that there was no wrong in that. So again, the conscience cannot always be the guide, as some would say, concerning Jiminy Cricket. There is an element in which that conscience has to be instructed in the right way. But he says they are, look at what else, by the way, they do by nature, key word, they do what? They do. So they're actually implementing, the things contained in the law. They, in essence, are keeping the law, the natural law that they've received, better than the Jew is keeping the divine law that's been revealed. So that's the contrast here. Okay, so these having not the law are a law unto themselves. What does that mean? Okay, do they get just to make up willy-nilly whatever law they want? Or they do? Well, so maybe in a secular sense that might be the case, but in the moral sense, what are they doing? Because they're practicing the moral law, they in essence have bound that moral stricture, understand and accept that moral stricture, and therefore comply with that moral stricture. Okay, so they are now bound to that law that they've recognized and acknowledged. That's the point. But here's the key part as you move forward into that passage, which show what? The work of the law, written in their hearts. So again, the actions, right, the pursuits of one who is to live godly, those things are written on their hearts. Now, we see in Jeremiah 31 that in the new dispensation, as Jeremiah is prophesying about the church, that God will write the law in their hearts. It won't be written on tables of stone. But here we're looking at the idea, as Paul is talking about this, they show the work of the law. So those actions that are right and good are written on their hearts. They're impressed upon them. It's interesting, I've had opportunity to discuss a lot of things with people who are not Christians about morality. And you know what? It's fascinating that they share the same kind of moral disposition that I do. Now, when you tell them that's a Christian morality, they get upset with you. But there is still that sense of moral oughtness in that. John?
When you say it's written in their hearts, law is, ain't that the conscience?
That would be the mind, yeah. Again, we'll talk about the mind in Romans 12. We'll talk about that in chapter 7 as well, and 8. But for certain, yes, that would be the mind and the heart, right? The internal man, okay, understanding and acknowledging those things.
I figured Cain didn't kill him. He should have a conscience, that was wrong.
Yeah, well, and as it was brought up by Diane, you know, the lack of acknowledgement in that case probably admitted that he knew that it was wrong. So,
That's why you got to dig him, right?
what's that?
That's why you got to dig him, right?
Yes, absolutely. So that was the curse for Cain. So again, their conscience also bearing witness. So we have the law that is acknowledged, that's implemented in practice, and then the conscience does what? Bears witness, their thoughts, the meanwhile accusing or else excusing one another. What does that mean? Accepting or rejecting. Okay, what do you mean by that?
Either convince themselves that they're doing right, which they know they're not, or comply by what God has instilled in their common law.
Complied by what now? What was that last phrase?
Doing good.
Okay, so a difference between good and bad, and their thoughts are confirming those things. Okay, so that's actually very down the line as to what he's saying here. He says their conscience either confirms the rightness of conduct or it condemns the wrongness of their conduct. In both of those statements here, the excusing one right here is the term where we get our term defense. So it might even be defending one another. So accusing or defending. Right, so there is, in one sense, we are doing that which is right, and our conscience is defending those actions as right and good. There is the other sense in which our actions are wrong, and our conscience is now accusing us of the wrongness of those pursuits. So all of this is happening in the heart and in the mind of those individuals who acknowledge the moral law and acknowledge that there is a standard that they're amenable to. So he says, and here's another part, and it's kind of weird how this is rendered. He says, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus according to my gospel. Well, that sounds kind of interesting. Where did that come from? So go back to verse 12. Okay, and then if we append this passage, okay, verse 16 onto verse 12, it has a full, complete thought. Right? So verse 12, he says, for as many as have sinned without the law or outlaw, shall also perish without law, and as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law. Okay, the law of Moses. Verse 16, in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. So we have almost a parenthetical statement in verses 14 through 16, or 15 rather, to kind of give us an idea of the fact that all men are amenable to God, no matter whether they've got the law of Moses, that is revealed divine revelation, or they are under the natural law, okay, that they've understood morally. Okay, the fact of the matter is no one can adhere to it perfectly, and therefore all are under condemnation. Is that fair to say that the Gentile is now under condemnation because he's not received, divine revelation? Yes, that is. It's certainly fair, okay? It's not unfair at all, okay? We looked at chapter 1, and what did Paul say about moral law? Yeah, it's being clearly seen, even his eternal power in Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Absolutely, morally, they're without excuse, but they didn't like to retain God in their knowledge, and so they abandoned that pursuit. So we're looking at Paul in this passage talking about the fact that Jew and Gentile are both under condemnation. Now, why does this matter for the letter to the church at Rome, or to the Christians at Rome, we might say? Again, when you tie it into context of the book.
He's saying regardless of whether you're Jew or Gentile, you both understand that you'll be judged by that standard. So
Yes, that's exactly right. Neither one was better than the other. They all stand in need of Christ because the law was imperfect to take away sin, okay? And the Gentiles had transgressed the law, okay, the moral law that they had. Jews didn't uphold it correctly. So now there's this statement that Paul is making to the church at Rome. If there's any conflict or any fighting in the church about superiority, Gentiles are better because we didn't do what the Jews did, or the Jews are better because we're the people of God and we have the keys to divine revelation, either side is impugned here by Paul in this text to show that all are under sin and neither one is better off than the other, okay? That's the point that Paul is driving home, okay? We'll see this as we get through the rest of the chapter. Did it die on me? Next slide, Jack, if you can. There we go. So 17 through 20, we get really the accusation against the Jewish folks there. He says, "Behold, you are called a Jew, and you rest in the law, and make your boast of God, and know His will, and approve the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law, and are confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, which has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law." Okay, what is Paul starting here? What's that?
The Jews should have been, they should have, they had the knowledge for all along. They should have been the ones instructing and guiding. But, I mean, we know they didn't, but that's what they should have done all along.
Yeah.
He said go out for the big call here.
Yeah. He's setting up, this is the predicate for denunciation, for really some rhetorical questions that are going to be hard-hitting. All right?
It's the accusation. What you should have done.
Well, and a couple of things to note. Why would they make their boast in the law? So he says, "And rest in the law, and makes thy boast of God, and know His will, and approve the things that are more excellent, being instructed out of the law." Are these compliments? Are they underhanded compliments? Or what are they intended to do?
Make the person who's reading this, they're Jewish, start thinking of themselves as better than the Gentiles. It's the beginning of an argument, like an intellectual argument. As you're reading it, you're like, yeah, I am that guy. Yeah, I am that guy. And then all of a sudden you read the next part of it, you're like, maybe I'm not that guy.
What's that?
Just bring awareness.
Bring awareness to it. Okay, Trudy says. And Joash says, starting the discussion of acknowledging maybe someone's position. Yes to both. But here's the statement that is, as Paul is making this, the question is, if you really are these things, okay, if all of these things apply to you, then why are you acting opposite the things that are supposed to be and be meaningful and matter? Okay, he's called a Jew. We know where that term derives from. It's from Judah, and when they went into captivity, we get the Jew. Great. We don't really need to spend a lot of time on that. And rests in the law. What does it mean, you rest in the law? You park your bus there. So the term there really means rely upon the law. Okay, where is their confidence? What's that? Yeah. Okay, so what does Paul say in Philippians chapter 3? As touching the law, what? Blameless. Okay, where did they find their righteousness? In the law. What does Paul in Romans chapter 5 tell us that the law did? The law showed sin. The law revealed sin. And so you get this boast of the Jews saying, we have the law. Okay, but the problem is they're not keeping it appropriately. You make your boast, you rely upon the law as being your sole way to righteousness, okay, which is important, Leviticus 18:5, to keep God's standard, right, for righteousness. But this went far beyond that. This did not go to the grace of God to commit that righteousness to them. What did it begin to do in their mind, in their estimation? We've done this ourselves. We've kept it. We're righteous because of what we have done. and it became self-righteousness. Okay, and that's what Paul is setting up here, is the idea of self-righteousness. We don't see this anywhere in the New Testament, do we? Anywhere else?
The whole premise of Paul's logic here is finished in verse 21. When he says, if you think you're a teacher, why don't you teach yourself?
Yeah, that's the point.
So that's the whole thing he's setting up here. You say you're all this, you say you're the law and all this, and he's highlighting the hypocrisy, which is what Jesus condemned them for all along.
Yes, that's exactly right. Right, that's exactly right. And so relying upon the law for their own self-righteousness, they completely forgot that they were in need of God's grace. So it was this element of entitlement, self-righteousness, look what I have done, I've worked myself. And now we see the unfolding of that in their actions, the hypocrisy of what they are doing and what they are saying. They don't match with what they're preaching. And here's the key. You know His will and you approve the things that are more excellent, being instructed, again, out of the law. Those are fine when done sincerely. Okay? Those are right. Paul encourages the church to know the will of God. In Colossians chapter 1, there, as he's praying for them, he tells them that they would learn or come to know the will of God. Okay? And so again, here's the key. You're confident that you yourself are a guide of the blind. Yes, ma'am.
This sort of is letting you know that the Jewish people, they had the law. They thought that was all they needed, was that they were under the law, so that saved them. Just like there are some people today who think just because they own the Bible would save. It is not. You've got to live by it. You've got to study it. You've got to understand it. And that's what saves you, is being obedient, not just owning the law or knowing about the law, but to practice it.
Yes, absolutely. Practicing of the law, of being obedient and faithful, sincerely faithful, right to God, brings about salvation. Steve, you have a comment?
Kind of piggyback on what Deborah was saying. You know, God gives us the full armor of God. I mean, the full armor. And the only weapon He gives us is the sword, which is the Word. And John 12:48 talks about when we stand in front of judgment, we're going to be judged by the Word and what we have done. So that sword that you take out of your armor, you sharpen it, you get it ready, you do that. So it's got to be a very active thing that we know God's Word and carry it out. And that's kind of basically what he's replicating here is we have to continue in the right, because God's will. We have to know it, we have to learn it, we have to do it.
That's exactly right. So there's that continuation there. You're absolutely right.
Isn't it ironic that the perfect schoolmaster, the perfect teacher that's supposed to elucidate sin in man, there elucidates and clarifies the sin of these Jews at this time, of the Jewish hierarchy, trying to keep the law so perfectly that they become so judgmental that, historically they couldn't keep the law, and now they're keeping the law to extreme. And we have to see that we are so in need of grace, because we can't keep the law. We're not supposed to keep it to perfection. We're supposed to keep the spirit of the law. And by Old Testament standards, they were ignoring the law. So it's interesting. It's an irony to me that the measuring stick for our sin shows our sin when we try to keep the law or we avoid the law.
Well, and I see what you're saying there. I will push back a little bit. Letter definitely was important, spirit along with the letter. So those two should have been united in the Old Testament. Again, Leviticus 19:18 and Deuteronomy 6:5.
Right.
And it's very clear that God expected the heart of the worshiper there, even with the strictures of the Levitical law. But the problem is the pendulum swing, right?
Well, and that's sinful man.
Yeah.
As you pointed out, it's like a course correction, because you pointed out, and I don't think preparation for that Wednesday series that we had, but you had talked about in the Old Testament how they couldn't keep the law, so this is a reaction. They were very reactive. But that's sinful man. We can never do it right, and that's the point, because the sweet spot right in the middle is letter of the law and
The spirit
The
of the
spirit of the law, right?
Absolutely. Well, and again, a lot of the things that they found that you're referring to went far beyond what the law, initialized. So they added to with all of these strictures that you're talking about. And so you're certainly correct there. And yes, Jesus, as the master teacher, came and showed how a life was to be lived toward God with the right disposition, with the right heart. You're absolutely right. So, and we can see that with the way he deals with the hypocrisy of the Pharisees in Matthew 23, which is our summer series. By the way, I want to encourage you to attend that. It's been a great exposition thus far as we've been going through that chapter. But again, we're looking here, and we'll see in just a moment that Paul is dealing with that very thing. Could Paul rightly accuse the Jews of this? Yes, because he was completely in the middle of it. He was ensconced in Pharisaism because he was a Pharisee of Pharisees. So he knew exactly what kind of hypocrisy was going on. But he says, you're confident that you're a guide of the blind, a light of them which are in darkness. That would be the Gentiles. You have the law. You point people to God. You're an instructor of the foolish. You have that privilege of teaching those who are not as smart as you, and a teacher of babes who has the form of knowledge and of the truth in the law. But here's the questioning that he comes to. Thou therefore who teaches another, do you not teach yourself? You that preaches a man should not steal, do you steal? You that says a man should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You that abhors idols, do you commit sacrilege? You who makes the boast of the law, through breaking the law, dishonorest thou God? For the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through you, as it is written. Okay, so here's the emphatic punch by Paul in this particular text, okay? Talking about the Jews and the law, he's asking them, when you are teaching others about the rightness or the morality of a certain action, are you not teaching yourself? Well, everyone who teaches should not only teach those that they're with, but themselves. Okay, how many of you, well, don't answer that. But when I get up here and when I prepare to study, or when I study and prepare for Bible class, do you know how convicting that is? Every time I pore over the biblical text, and do you know how little I feel when it comes to teaching and even having the opportunity to stand before so many with so many different experiences and life things to teach God's word to people that I believe know it far better than I do? That's humbling. And what he's asking them is, when you prepare and when you are teaching others morality, and this should be, by the way, an answer to yes, shouldn't you be teaching yourself? The implied answer is yes. But actually, the implied answer to this one is no. They don't teach themselves. They're not doing that, but it should be. It's the adversative here. And so, anyway, what he's asking them is, you who know the law so well and boast in all of these things, why aren't you doing it? He says, you who preach that a man should not steal, are you a thief? I mean, do you steal? Okay, and he doesn't mean just like, oh no, I'm preaching a perfect standard and I fall short of it from time to time. That's not it. He's talking about a lifestyle, a practice, a pursuit. Are you a thief who's teaching others not to steal? In essence, are you a hypocrite? Now, I realize that in some sense, every one of us are hypocrites, in that we preach a perfect gospel that we fall short of. So in that case, that's true. But we're talking about the intentional violation, okay, of a lifestyle that goes against what we are preaching. Okay, that's the hypocrite that Christ is referring to in Matthew 23. Here he says, as Paul is talking to them, you say a man should not commit adultery. Are you an adulterer? By the way, the priesthood and those that were in the Sanhedrin and those that were Pharisees and Sadducees were unbelievably sexually immoral. Okay, Josephus talks about that. Several other early historians talk about that. So that's not a foreign concept, and this is a fair condemnation, by the way, of them. He says, you that abhors idols, do you commit sacrilege? What does he mean by that? This might be the most difficult one in the discussion. Yeah, so the temple, here's the thing. The term that is used there can be a reference to sacrilege or to temple robbers, okay, those who would go in and steal out of the treasury of a temple, or which the Jews, by the way, at least it's told that they were notorious for this. Josephus actually comments about the idea of Jews going in and sacking pagan temples. If you look in the uproar at Ephesus in Acts chapter 18, I believe it is, the city clerk basically acquits Paul and his compatriots of at least temple robbery and says you're not, robbing temples, which is to show that there was a practice of doing that. But what he's talking about here is the hypocrisy of one who says that idolatry is absolutely wrong, it's heinous, you can't do it, and then you go in and you defile God's temple. You defile what God has set up. Right? That is, you despise idols to the acknowledgement of God, and then you defile God and what He's set up. Okay, that's the hypocrisy of what is going on here. Did the Jews ever do this? Yeah, when Jesus drove the money changers out of the temple, what had they done? They had defiled the temple. They had committed sacrilege here because they had turned God's house into, what does Jesus call it? A den of thieves. That's exactly right. So again, fraud and every kind of terrible thing financially that was going on there, extorting the poor. So it was awful. And so again, he's saying, you who abhor idols, which is the right thing to do, idolatry is wrong, are you defiling God and the temple? So it's right to abhor idols. It's wrong to defile God. So again, thou that makes your boast of the law, through breaking the law, do you dishonor God? Yeah, okay, you're excited about the law, and yet you don't keep it at all. You tell everybody that you are a Jew and that you're pursuing Jewish customs, Jewish rights, you're practicing all these things, and yet you never practice them. And again, there is that dishonor. So then what do we see that is written? For the name of God is what? Blasphemed among the Gentiles because of you, as it is written. Okay, so that's pretty stout, Paul. Why are you fussing at them in this way? Well, again, to show that all are under sin, and that if the Jew thought he had a pedestal to stand on in being better than the Gentile, Paul says, certainly not. You don't. No one escapes God's judgment. Okay? And so even though the Jews had the law, they treated the law with contempt in the way that they adhered to its practices, or taught its practices, or had a view of themselves. Now, is it good that God is blasphemed among the Gentiles? No, it's not, because what is the purpose of Christianity? Well, to draw all men to God. Can Christians cause the name of Christ to be blasphemed? Yeah, I've seen it happen. How do they do that, though? Lots of answers. What is that, Joel? Hypocrisy. Hypocrisy. Yeah, that's the capital H hypocrisy, right? Yeah. People wanting to have a moral superiority over others and looking down upon them, despising them, and being hypocrites when it comes to their faith, for sure.
Doing all this character stuff, and I have to go, yeah, and if I die right now, I'm going straight to bed, straight.
Yeah, and so what happens, and that's an excellent point, because what happens to your ability to influence people for good? Yes, it diminishes, in a polite way to say it. It vanishes, doesn't it? And as a result, people say, if that's Christianity, I don't want any part of that. I don't want to have anything to do with those people, because that is not what I want to be a part of. So again, yes, the name of God is blasphemed among the Gentiles through them, as it is written, as he's talking about here. So,
Just a curious question. The ESV leaves off as it is written. You know why that, I mean, I'm sure in the ESV it's left out because it wasn't all manuscripts. Is there a reference?
So the reference is Isaiah 52:5.
I saw that, but it wasn't really clear to
And are you saying that it leaves off the as it is written? Yeah, so in the original it says as it is written. It says even as it is written. So, but, yeah, I don't think that's a variant that is significant. But it's if they leave it off, then it's certainly a variant that the translators... It did not leave it off? Okay.
From the first beginning of the verse.
Oh, okay. All right. That's all right. No worries. So for circumcision, well, wait a minute. Is he talking about circumcision here? No. So why do we all of a sudden go into circumcision? Yeah, so apart for the whole, okay, so the idea that who are the circumcised? Well, the only ones that were circumcised, right, religiously were the Jews, okay, so this is a reference to Jewish folks. For circumcision, that is your boast in the law, profits if what? If you keep the law. If you're a Jew, it's only profitable if you keep the law. Are Jews going to heaven just by virtue of their Jewness and not because of them being faithful to God? No. No, not at all, okay? So it doesn't matter what nationality you are, what ethnicity you are. If you don't practice the law of God, you're not going to be saved. And that's the point that Paul is driving home. He says it only profits if you keep the law. But if you're a breaker of the law, your circumcision is made uncircumcision. You become not one of God's people, okay? You're put out from His presence. That's the idea, okay? Therefore, if the uncircumcision, that would be the Gentile, keeps the righteousness of the law, that is through an understanding or acknowledging of moral law, shall not his uncircumcision be counted for circumcision? By the way, this is Abraham. Okay, the whole argument around Abraham we'll see in chapter 4 about this very thing. And shall not uncircumcision, which is by nature, if it fulfills the law, judge you who by the letter and circumcision transgress the law? For he is not a Jew, which is one outwardly, neither is that circumcision, which is outward in the flesh, but he is a Jew, which is one inwardly. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not of men, but of God. What is the whole point of chapter 2?
Doesn't matter what you do physically, it matters what you do spiritually.
Okay, doesn't matter what you do physically, it matters what you do spiritually. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
As far as using this circumstance as being circumcised.
Okay.
It doesn't apply to anything. It's what you have within yourself to present.
Yeah, okay, so...
Regardless of a body alteration.
Yeah, so the whole point of chapter 2 would be those who keep the law of God or don't. Whether they're Jew or Gentile, those who are keeping the law of God and those who aren't. Those who aren't keeping the law of God, whether they're Jew or Gentile, are condemned. Those who are keeping the law of God, whether general law, moral law that's been revealed. Now we know at this point that's not the case. It's going to be Christianity, all right? But all are under sin, okay? And that's the point. And so as he puts the exclamation point on this, that will lay the groundwork for chapter 10, all right, as we move into chapter 10 and 11. But who is Israel? Paul says not all Israel are Israel. What does that mean? He's referring to what?
In extension, he's referring to the church, but the Israel's corporate. It's not just the Jews. It's everybody who is under God's favor. So not all Jews are just Israel.
Yes, that's exactly right. So not all national Israel is Israel, the church, God's people, okay? That's the whole point. And how does this occur? Well, Paul's going to talk about that and how Gentiles are brought into the faith. See, again, this is an argument for the supremacy of Christ and the bringing together of Gentile world and Jewish viewpoints and God's chosen people. All right, and so we'll pick that up in chapter 3 next week. I appreciate your attention. The lesson is yours.